Hi everyone, welcome to Watch Hags. My name is Ken.
I'm David.
And behind the camera,
I'm Wilson.
We've spent a lot of time in the last few episodes talking about backstories and history, and I think we thought that it would be a nice next discussion just to go to the vintage segment, David, and the watches that are old, that people are focusing a lot on and spend a lot of time collecting. And so David, tell me a little bit what you consider to be vintage and what's drawn you to this particular area.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ken. You're right. I mean, the whole vintage craze, I'm going to call it that, is something that you and I, and even Wilson, you've seen in the past 5-10 years where certain watches were quite reasonable, now they're unattainable. And so it's interesting to see how it's really evolved. So if you were just to Google, what is a vintage watch, you'll see that there is a definition that's probably widely accepted, that it is a watch that is no longer in production and is at least 20 years old. And so that's one definition of it. That makes a lot of sense. But then also, like for me, when I was looking for a vintage watch, I was also looking for something that had some interesting story behind it. And I think for our viewers, you'll probably notice that there is something that's pervasive amongst what we buy as watches. There's a story behind the watch, right? And so for me, when I was looking around, I finally settled on a Rolex. And so that's not surprising given how popular Rolex is now, especially in the vintage market. But for me, what I wanted to find was not just a vintage Rolex, but something that had an interesting story. And one model that stuck out in my mind, that had kind of flown under the radar for quite some time, is the one that's called the Rolex Tornograph. There's also a model they call the Rolex Thunderbird. It is a Datejust size, so very familiar for people who know Rolex. Yeah. It's very comfortable, definitely you can wear it for almost any occasion. And mine though, I decided to put it even more casually on a leather strap. Yeah. And so the first Rolex Tornograph actually came out in 1953. And at that time, it was the first commercially produced Rolex that actually had a turning bezel. And for a lot of people that see this watch for the first time, they never realize that actually you can turn the bezel. And so it's bi-directional, and it was really designed for people to time things, right? So you rotate the little marker to the minute hand, and you can see what the elapsed time is over time. But then, quickly, Rolex pivoted this watch towards pilots. And it then became known as a quote-unquote pilot watch, and it was adopted by the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds, which is a performance flight team. Yeah. And so then it became known as the Thunderbird watch. And it's actually kind of a shame that Rolex stopped making it back in, I think, 2011. Because I still find it to be one of the most interesting, quite different from the rest, the entire line of Rolex. And which is really, again, I think what drew me to it was to find this specific model in a vintage, so more than 20 years. No longer produced, again, not since 2011. But the icing on the cake was that I was lucky, very, very lucky, to find it in my birth year. And so I was very lucky to find it kind of ticking all the boxes. My birth year, nice vintage, very good condition. But also, more importantly, I found a great seller that was able to give it to me for a good price. And so when you're looking at vintage watches, I often get asked, what do you look for? How do you find something that's not going to be a piece of junk or some sort of like quote-unquote a fake vintage? Yeah. And this is a rule of thumb I always use, is that you want to buy the seller, not just buy the watch, right? So you find a reputable dealer, somebody you can trust, someone who knows the vintage game, and they can help you in that search. They may not have exactly what you want right in their store then and there, but they can help you find it. Yeah. And so when I was started on my journey, I was narrowing it down to, yes, I wanted the Rolex, I wanted a Tornograph, reference 1625. At that time, I wasn't too picky on the dial color, but it so happens that the one I had is a really pretty blue. Yeah. And then, of course, I stumbled across this great seller who specialized in vintage watches, and he really made me feel a lot more comfortable about, and confident rather, than what I was going to get. Now, the other question I get as well is, how do you maintain your vintage watch? Well, luckily, it is Rolex, right? And so the great thing that Rolex continues to do is support its products. So I can actually take my 40-year-old watch, I can take it to a Rolex service center, and I have the confidence that they can actually make any repairs on them. And so that's a great level of support.
I mean, of course, you've got a tremendous service that the Rolex Service Center provides, but in addition to that, because they were just produced in such large quantities, a very good population of watchmakers out there know how to service and maintain these watches at a very reasonable price.
Yeah.
So I think that's another strong draw to me for Rolex as a choice.
Yeah, and I would just say it's not an exact science of how you can find the best vintage watch, right? It's really an art, right? And I would say follow your your initial passion of what do you think is something that is not only resonates with you but something that you can wear, but then of course something that can be maintained. And again, I was very fortunate to come across this one, and it's the Rolex 1625 called the Tornograph. I love it; it's a great watch. What about you, Ken? What are you wearing today?
This is my oldest watch. It's a Grand Seiko 45 GS. I don't have an exact date, but it dates back to the late 60s when Seiko was really making its mark on the world. As legend would have it, there was a chronometer watch timing competition in Geneva, and they submitted a number of their specimens there and actually won many of the first few prizes in quite an upset over the Swiss, and that really put Seiko on the map, and Grand Seiko came out in that period of time. So it's just amazing. I mean, it's a watch that basically is older than me and still tells the time really well. I think probably the only concern that I have on this one is, unlike Rolex, Grand Seiko is not easily serviced around the world. But if you go back to Japan, then there are quite a lot of watchmakers familiar with it. It's probably the only major thing. But other than that, it's an amazing watch. And then from the late 60s, it's still telling the time accurately till today. This particular model has got a lot of the DNA of Grand Seiko in it. It has what's called the grammar of design case, where you have the sharp facets, which are quite common these days. You see them on designs from people like Audemars Piguet, from Patek Philippe and Nautilus. They had these sharp designs back then, so it's a phenomenal watch. It's a manual line. And it also sports a high beat movement as well too, which you don't also see that commonly, and particularly back in the late 60s, it's quite remarkable. The good thing is Grand Seiko now is becoming a more widespread brand. It's now penetrated a lot of the international market and is becoming increasingly popular. And they've actually got this same design but with a modern movement and so on as well. Right? This so-called grammar of design case.
Yeah, if I can just add, as I'm staring at your watch, it's amazing that it is as old as it is. But the other thing I would add is that for anyone who's considering a Grand Seiko, whether it's a vintage or a modern one, they look so much better in person than in the photos. Do not make your final judgment just based on the images you find online. It's amazing. And on the design itself, you mentioned the grammar design. You just looking at it, I can almost see how it's influenced even Genta and some of the pieces that he's produced, right?
No, absolutely.
It's a fantastic piece.
And the other thing that's interesting on the back, on the case back, it's a solid case back, but this particular one I was very fortunate to get. It's been engraved. And essentially what the Japanese text here is saying that it was awarded to an employee for his or her 30th anniversary at Fujifilm. It's just such a remarkable gift to receive. It's just a wonderful milestone, right? And David, I think one other thing I'd like to tell you about this one is also the strap. This strap I bought some years after I got the watch, but it's also a very unique strap. It comes from a company called George Cleverley. It's actually made of Russian reindeer, and this particular leather sample is around 200 years old. It was being shipped to Italy on a ship, and it sunk off the coast of England and basically remained there until 1973 when a bunch of archaeologists found it. They dove down and found amongst the cargo this Russian reindeer, which at the time had been treated to be water resistant, right, waterproof. And true enough,
little did they know how much it needed to be waterproof.
Yeah.
Goodness, wow.
I mean, the ship, right, the Meta Caterina, sank in 1786.
My goodness, wow.
They found it in 1973, and George Cleverley, obviously, recognizing how special this leather would be and how well preserved it was, bought the entire collection. And we're making shoes and subsequently small leather goods such as the strap and wallets out of it. So just a remarkable story to pair with this particular watch.
That's fantastic. That's amazing. Wow, that's great. And I'm glad that when we sit down, we're still very, very passionate about vintage watches. And I'm glad that we had a chance to share some of this, with our viewers out there. And so I'm pretty sure this won't be the last time we talk about vintage watches. I think it's a good way to kind of kick things off.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you shared your story about, again, very fascinating, especially on the Grand Seiko. But then also, I'm always very keen to share with people about my Rolex and the journey I took. And I would just say that again, if you're going down that path of vintage, don't be afraid, right? But then also, I always say to people, don't buy the watches, buy the seller first, if you know what I mean. Find that right seller that can help you,
Yep.
right? And it's interesting, a journey to be on, and I'm sure that with some time, and I would say some patience as well, you'll find a vintage watch that's worthy of your collection. So I hope today's session was interesting for everyone. Please, as always, please like and subscribe, and of course your comments. We're always keen to hear back on what we could be doing better, or perhaps even what can we show on our next episode. We're still at the drawing board, so please, we look forward to hearing from you. So thanks for watching.